Salam.
Okay. Are we ready?
Yes, we're ready to go. So welcome, Dr. Sharif. Just a quick introduction on Dr. Sharif. He holds a PhD in Islamic Studies from McGill University and currently serves as Associate Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Brandeis University outside of Boston. He has recently published a study on Ibn Taymiyyah's the Darth al-Aql wal-Naql and is interested in the many philosophical, moral, and other challenges facing Muslims in the modern world. So welcome, Dr. Sharif, and let's get started.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. جزاكم الله خيرا to the organizers of this conference. I'm very honored to be with you today. I wish I could be there in person in Houston. It is very rainy and a bit cold where I am today. I hope it's better weather down there. I know you've had your share of difficult and trying weather this year, so may Allah protect you and protect us all, inshallah. Can I share my screen?
Yes, you should be able to.
All right, so let me just start this. Okay. So the topic that I have been asked to address you on today is gender, sexuality, morality, and identity in Islam. Of course, a very light topic that can be, dealt with easily within about 5-10 minutes. I don't know why they gave me a whole 2 hours, but anyway, we'll do what we can. Obviously, this is a huge topic. It's a topic of great importance. There are many issues that come up. We'll be looking at, We'll be looking at questions of gender, sexuality with a focus on homosexuality and the challenges and questions that arise for us as Muslims today in terms of the LGBT kind of movement and sort of pressure and questions that come up. And so what we want to do
Dr.
first.
Sharif?
Yes.
I'm sorry. There is a request for you to, if you could speak a bit louder. I think we're having difficulty hearing you.
Okay. Is this better?
Close. Is this better? Is it better for everybody?
Better if I like this? Yes? Okay. I feel like I'm shouting, but okay. So before we get into the question of homosexuality and transgenderism and so forth, we need to get a general sense of gender, sexuality, morality, identity, all of these other questions, because these are the terms of reference in terms of which the discussion is framed. And as we will see, it is very important to get one's terms and concepts correct when one wants to discuss a particular matter and come to any type of conclusions on it. So why are we even having this discussion today? So we are basically living in the shadows or the aftermath of what is known as the sexual revolution, which is a movement that begins in the late 1960s in the Western world, and it begins in the late 1960s in the Western world and spreads throughout all Western countries very rapidly. And basically, it includes or it entails a fundamental rejection of Christian, Abrahamic, and religious moral norms surrounding gender, sex, and sexuality. Now, prior to this time, sexual norms in the West, at least official sexual norms, were closely keyed to Christian moral values, and Christianity, just like Islam, prohibits zina, i.e. extramarital or premarital sex. It also prohibited things like abortion. All of these things were a cultural norm in the United States. People probably don't know this, but in the 1960s, it was even taboo to use the word pregnant on daily soap operas on television. I'm not calling for that. I mean, pregnant, there's nothing wrong with saying that, but that's just where the culture was. So you would use euphemisms like saying, oh, so-and-so is with child or so-and-so is expecting. But just to say so-and-so is pregnant was considered, too forward. It was a private domain. It was something that people were shy to speak about. And so it was better not to speak about things so directly. You can obviously compare that to where we are now in terms of not only daytime soap operas, but just the general programming in general. Everything is allowed now, everything is explicit, everything is spoken, everything is shown practically. But this is a huge tidal wave of a change that has occurred over the last 50 years. Also, in all Western countries until the late 1960s, pornography was illegal everywhere. And in 1967, Denmark and Holland, two of the most liberal and kind of most secular European countries, moved to decriminalize written pornography. Now, when I say written pornography, I mean novels, of salacious novels, like whatever the 50 Shades of Grey that they have. Imagine a Europe where that would have been forbidden, that would have been banned. You would not have been able to write, produce, or mass produce or sell publicly such literature because it contained explicit descriptions of sexual behavior, right? 1967, this becomes allowed. Then 1969, everything else becomes allowed, including photographs, videos, and so forth. And in those two countries, Denmark and Holland, it was so extreme that there were no limits or no controls put on whatsoever, to the extent that even child pornography was perfectly legal all throughout the 1970s, meaning it was literally legal to essentially rape children on camera and then mass produce and distribute the videos and pictures that came from this for profit. And it was not until the late 1970s that people figured, well, maybe we should at least regulate child pornography. And so they banned it in the late 70s. But those two countries remain a global hub of child pornography because of the years in which it was perfectly legal. Now, of course, not all of the sexual revolution would go to the extreme of legalizing something like child pornography, but it just shows you the times that were about at that time and the radical shift that was taking place in the culture. And as we said, this entailed a fundamental rejection of Christian moral norms surrounding sexuality, right? One of the main catalysts of this earlier on in the decade was the development of the birth control pill. Before the birth control pill, you basically did not have any reliable means of averting pregnancy if you were going to engage in sexual activity. Sexual activity is a reproductive activity, right? It's a male and female reproductive organs coming together and basically engaging in a reproductive act. It does not mean that we don't have other meanings that we attach to sexuality. It doesn't mean that sexuality doesn't play other functions in our lives, even legitimately from an Islamic point of view, but it is at the core a reproductive act, right? If you take biology class, we talk about the reproductive system, and it's very clear that the act is a reproductive act first and foremost, right? So before the 1960s, you had condoms. They were not very reliable. So anyone who was going to engage in a sexual act was always risking pregnancy, which was a very big deal, right? You can't just have children born out of wedlock and then no father responsible and so on. It's a big disaster. And so if you look across the world, really, you'll find in almost every civilization until very recently, right? Sex is tied to reproduction. And because it's tied to reproduction, it's usually constricted to marriage, which is the context in which it is proper for reproduction to take place, so that children are born in a predictable and stable environment. They know who their parents are. The father is financially responsible. The mother is responsible for caring for the child and so forth, right? You cannot afford to have a loose sexual morality in the absence of any type of reliable birth control, right? And so the norms in Western society perhaps were as much due to Christianity as they were to just the pragmatics of the situation. And perhaps more to the latter, because once the pill comes on the scene, you see very rapidly there is a challenging of the moral norms surrounding sexuality. Whereas in the Muslim world, for example, that didn't happen, right? The pill exists. It exists all over the world. You can get it anywhere. It's probably more restricted in Muslim countries, but it's still there. And the simple presence of the pill did not, launch or unleash a sexual revolution in the Muslim world, or in China for that matter, or other places, as you saw in the Western world. So this is a Western cultural phenomenon. One of the main sort of fallouts of this was that you see a separation. We had said that sex, reproduction, and marriage were very tightly bound together in the culture, as they are in Christian religion, as they are in Islam, as we shall see, and as we all know anyway as Muslims. The sexual revolution basically splits the atom and separates sex, reproduction, and marriage. So whereas they were all tightly bound before, they all become seen as just free-floating variables. You can have sex completely outside of marriage, which was a big taboo before, premarital sex. Even when I was growing up in the 1970s, early 1980s, I remember it was very much a question. People would say, what do you think of premarital sex? In other words, what do you think morally about it? I mean, because it was a new thing. And people were still ambivalent about it. Many people said, no, that's immoral. You have to be married, right, to have sex. Like, it's not moral to have it out of wedlock. In 1968, I believe it was, at the height of the sexual revolution, here in Cambridge, you have Harvard University, which was for boys, and then you had Radcliffe College next to it, which was for girls. And a female student was actually expelled from Radcliffe University or college because she was living with a boyfriend outside of wedlock. This was so unacceptable just 50 years ago in Western culture that she was not simply reprimanded, she was actually kicked out of the university. Harvard/Radcliffe basically said, you're not fit, we're not going to give you a degree. This moral behavior is so outrageous, right? You're actually living publicly with a man outside of wedlock. It's completely unacceptable. You're expelled from the university. So imagine that. That was only 50 years ago. So times have certainly changed a great deal. Attendant upon the sexual revolution, we see very quickly a high rise in the rate of divorce. This is also this kind of push for women to leave the home, by and large. Most middle-class women at that time, again, I grew up in the late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s even, and we lived right next to a middle-class neighborhood. I think out of 15 houses, maybe there was one woman who was a teacher. I think every other woman was home. That was just the norm then, that women were primarily taking care of their families and the men were basically, supporting the family financially. So there's a push for women out into the workforce. There's a liberalization of sexual norms. There's a repudiation of Christian morality on sex, a separation of sex, reproduction, and marriage. We see a rise of the divorce rate after this. We see a demise of the nuclear family. We see huge social dislocations which come out of this. Fatherlessness, delinquency rises majorly from the 1980s until now. The phenomenon of single motherhood, poverty, especially for single mothers. The mothers, when there's a high divorce rate, usually end up with the custody of the kids. And even if they're getting alimony, they usually, have to fend for themselves. And you have this, phenomenon also of female poverty, particularly in single motherhood poverty. So a lot of fallout for this. Within this context, to go towards what we're going to be concentrating more a bit later on, the visibility and the prominence of homosexuality in the gay rights / liberation movement, as it's called, kind of rides on the coattails of the sexual revolution. Again, when sex is tied to reproduction and family, homosexuality doesn't really fit into the equation. It existed, it was underground, it was of course very taboo, it's actually illegal all over the United States and most of the Western world. It's difficult to even conceptualize and talk about that when your paradigm of sexuality is one that's based, again, on sort of the natural function of sexuality, when the natural function of sexuality is endowed with meaning, when the male-female relationship is endowed with intrinsic purpose and the family and so forth. But once all of that gets sort of blown to smithereens and questioned fundamentally, you now have a rise of the discussion of other forms of sexual behavior. Because once you separate sex from religious morality and from reproduction, then all of a sudden something like same-sex behavior becomes conceivable, and then it comes to be seen as being morally neutral. Well, what's wrong with it? Because we're not tying sex anymore to marriage, religion, morality, or reproduction, right? So then it looks like arbitrary to sort of say, well, we accept heterosexual behavior, but not homosexual behavior. But it's only arbitrary when you've already broken apart this, unity that we were talking about before, and you radically change your fundamental presuppositions regarding gender, regarding sex, sexuality, morality, the place of religion, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this brave new world that we're living in, ever since the last 52 years now or so, puts all traditional religious believers in a difficult position because all traditional religions basically have a paradigm which is starkly at odds with this new kind of unprecedented social experiment that we've been in with the results that we've mentioned for the last half century. Okay, so before we get back to this, into contemporary concerns, we want to take a step back. We're Muslims, obviously. That means that we start from a position of Islam as our normative framework. And so we want to build an Islamic understanding first and foremost. Right? As we've said in the beginning, and we'll see this principle coming later on, the way what you think about a subject, what you decide about it, how you judge it, very much depends on how you conceive of it, right? And language is not innocent. So people throw around language And, it carries a lot of assumptions, including most of the language that's used today to discuss this issue, LGBT, marriage equality, for example, all of these things. All of these are terms that carry a lot of baggage and a lot of presuppositions. So before we get into that, we want to look at what is our framework of dealing with these things as Muslims so that they make sense to us from within an Islamic paradigm. So just a few verses from the Quran, we'll try to go quickly. On Allah's creation of the male and the female as two distinct and complementary types of human beings, وَمَا خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى, and by his creation of the male and the female, وَأَنَّهُ خَلَقَ الزَّوْجَيْنِ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى, and he created the two mates, the male and the female, وَلَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنثَى, and the male is not like the female. In other words, of course, we know men and women are spiritually equal and have equal, rights to souls. I mean, they both equally have souls and equal possibility of developing taqwa and being admitted to paradise and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that they're exactly the same. There are physical differences, there are dispositional differences, there are differences in the Sharia and so forth. And so Allah says, "Laysa dhakaru kal untha," the male is not like the female. Not that one is better or superior to the other, but that they're not the same. And then I'll read in English to save time. And among his signs is that he created for you from yourselves mates that you might find tranquility in them, meaning in marriage. And he placed between you affection and mercy. Indeed, in that are signs for people who reflect. And then the last verse, O mankind, fear your Lord who created you from one soul and created from it its mate and dispersed from both of them many men and women, right? And we all know this because it's usually recited at the beginning of the Friday khutbah. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء. We all know this verse. So these are just a few of the verses in which Allah talks about the male and the female. Now, if we move on, so to the consideration of the difference and complementarity of the male and the female that we've spoken about briefly. So there's difference in complementarity, as we've seen, laysa dhakaru kal untha, the male is not like the female. There are obvious biological there's an obvious biological complementarity between male-female bodies, the reproductive system. This is clear to the naked eye. It doesn't need to be harped upon, although the importance and the sort of significance of this is radically denied in our age, right? But we need to recover what is the actual underlying truth of these matters, okay? Our understanding also, which I've mentioned before, and I'm going to underline it again here, is that we operate on the assumption of that there's a purpose or an inherent purpose or teleology to the body and its functions as created by God, right? Allah is the one who created the heavens and the earth. He's the one who created us. He created our bodies, male and female. He created our souls. He created our different functions. And he created them with a purpose. And it's obvious, as we said, that the purpose of sexuality, the primary purpose of it, is reproductive. And our reproductive organs are primarily that. They are reproductive organs, and they are there for a purpose that's intended by a wise creator. This is very different when you're coming from a secular paradigm and you're just viewing human beings as having evolved through random, blind processes, mutation and natural selection or whatever, and having risen from lower life forms and so forth without any guidance or intent behind it. And then you're sort of left, therefore, as sovereign to decide on your own what your own purpose is in life in general, right? And this is why you have a crisis of meaning in the modern West, right? And then you're sovereign over your own body, you're sovereign over your own life, you're sovereign over your private parts, and you can just do it with them whatever you want, right? That's the attitude that reigns today. Of course, this is diametrically opposed to our understanding because we don't see ourselves as having been brought about randomly through blind forces, but rather as having been created deliberately as Khalifa fil Ard, vicegerents on the earth, to fulfill a noble purpose, a spiritual and a moral purpose on earth, in serving and worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, commanding the good, forbidding the evil, spreading the khair, what is good, and so forth, right? So we see in the body and in its functions, particularly its sexual function, we see that it has a purpose, right? And that purpose, and is through honoring that purpose in the proper context, that sexual acts gain their meaning, that they gain their significance, that they gain their legitimacy, moral, religious, and spiritual legitimacy. And outside of that context, they lose that legitimacy and they become inherently immoral, or to use the language of the Catholic Church about same-sex behavior particularly, it says that same-sex acts are inherently disordered. And a lot of people take offense at that, but what it means is that inherently speaking, if you look at a male and a male body, there's just inherently, it doesn't fit, right? Or two females, it doesn't go together. It's clear that it's not meant to fit, quite literally, right? To fit, right? And so this is very different from the current, my body, my choice. My body, I can do whatever I want, I choose. This is not obviously the Islamic paradigm, although it's rampant, and this is what most people take for granted. And many Muslims, unfortunately, also fall into this type of, mentality simply by cultural contagion. We're affected by the culture around us, and then many Muslims start to repeat this kind of, empty rhetoric: my body, my choice, my autonomy. We'll get to this later on. Okay, men and women are also complementary in disposition, or khilqa. You have broadly masculine versus feminine traits. Fathers and mothers are not interchangeable. There are many studies about this. Religious rules for men and others for women, even in the prayer, right? Men and women pray roughly the same, but men stand with their feet further apart. Women put them together. Men in the sujood, it's more extended. Women, it's more contracted, right? So Islam recognizes gender difference and actually valorizes it and enforces it and celebrates it, which again is diametrically opposed to our current culture, which tries as hard as possible to completely abrogate and squash and erase any type of gender difference anywhere, seeing in it, symbols of oppression and patriarchy and so forth. And so there's this sort of, mad quest to crush any gender distinctions whatsoever. And we would just simply hold that this is false. This is not in conformity with our own fitra, our predisposition that Allah has created us on. And there are many studies they show, even in Sweden and other Scandinavian countries, which are very liberal in terms of their gender norms and gender egalitarianism, the more gender equal they become, the more men and women naturally start to tend to different types of professions, even when they're under zero constraint, perhaps particularly when they're under zero constraint to do so. And so in Scandinavia, they're saying, where are all the women in STEM? It doesn't mean women can't do STEM, but in general, right, men tend to gravitate more to those types of fields and women to other fields. It's not a judgment call, it's just that there are different proclivities. And where men and women are allowed to develop naturally, you will find that they will naturally diverge. So this idea that, a just society is one in which men and women are doing exactly the same thing 50-50 in every human vocation is a fantasy, right? It's an ideological kind of presupposition that can only be brought about through a substantial social engineering and also fighting against natural trends. Alhamdulillah, as Muslims, we don't even get onto that bus to begin with, because it's clear from the Sharia that men and women, although equal in many fundamental respects, are not the same, and the Sharia doesn't treat them the same. And so we don't have an expectation of gender parity or equality in the contemporary Western sense. What we have an expectation of is gender equity and fairness and justice, which is not the same as mathematical sameness. Anyway, we'll go very quickly. So fitri differences, Allah's attributes by some thinkers in our tradition are roughly divided into attributes of jalal or majesty and attributes of jamal or beauty. And jalali attributes of power, strength, and so forth tend to be dominant in the male, whereas attributes of beauty and refinement and so forth tend to be dominant in the female. It doesn't mean that both don't partake of both. Of course they do, but we're just talking about dominant traits. And that's also why men are in general more suited for certain types of vocations and women for others, because they are responding to an inner nature. And the beauty about it is that both of these sets of traits, whether it's the jalali, more quote unquote masculine traits, or the jamali, more feminine traits, both of them are actually taken from Allah's qualities, which means Allah in his own being, right, when he's a perfect being, actually blends very beautifully the jalali traits and the jamali traits. And this shows also how there's a metaphysical complementarity between the male and the female principles, right, which is very important for us to remember that, in joining together the male and the female, there's a wholeness which is brought about, because you have the masculine and the feminine, bringing their different traits and their different strengths into an integrated whole, in the way that Allah's being is one. I mean, of course, we're not comparing ourselves or our coming together with Allah. That's not what I mean to do, but just to show that that unity comes about through the union of the male and the female. And that's not possible through the union of two males or two females, right? So there's a metaphysical dimension about that, which is problematic in addition to the physical, in addition to the social, and others, as we will see. And then we said many scientific studies show all sorts of physiological, psychological, and dispositional differences between men and women. This is taboo to talk about today, of course, because it goes against notions of social constructionism, namely that any and all gender distinctions that we see or differences are merely constructions of society. Everyone's heard this before, because again, this is rampant vocabulary, meaning that there is really no such thing as a male or female trait or personality type or tendencies that are somehow innate or inborn, but they're all purely constructed. And that's why people who hold this belief think that if we just construct society a different way, we'll just be able to come up with a completely different result and a different reality, because they don't believe that there are any inborn inherent differences, right? Again, this has been proven over and over and over again to be false and not to work. And who knows how long it's going to be until people realize that once again, but it's not where the current culture is right now, which again doesn't necessarily make things more comfortable for us as Muslims, but we need to be aware of these facts and also factors, and also how they are problematic. And also because again, they do form the framework which shapes our language in discussion and categories often when we go to discuss these types of issues. And the reason I'm spending time on this is because our discussion on gender, our discussion on sexuality, our discussion on morality, on homosexuality, on transgenderism, all of these things can't even get off the ground if we don't have our own conceptual framework in place with our own vocabulary that's attached to it, that is based on the truth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed to us through his last messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And which, because he's the creator of the universe and the sender of revelation, right? Revelation is revealing to us the fact of the matter, the truth of reality. And when you turn away from revelation, as Allah, you're left in the dark, right? Because Allah knows and we don't know. And so when we turn our backs collectively on revelation, which is what happened also when, the Western world turned its back on Christian sexual morality, which, Christianity, obviously the Aqidah is problematic, but the general moral norms, of course, is, it comes from the same source ultimately, right? As a tradition that starts with the Sharia of Musa alayhi salam. And so turning away from this also means that people are going to be going into a path of darkness and confusion about things, which again, 30 years ago, it would have been inconceivable that we would be having discussions as to what a man and a woman are. And that this would be a major social contention, completely inconceivable even 20 years ago, that this could ever be a question. Like, it's so obvious, right? And yet here we are. Okay, so moving right along. So Islamic sexual and gender norms. So how do we now build up our own framework or continue building our own framework? So I just want to say a few words about the centrality of sexual norms to any society and moral system. As we said before, sexuality, especially before yesterday, with the rise of fairly reliable means of artificial contraception like the pill, sexual norms are central to any society and any moral system because sex is a very powerful and potentially unruly and potentially dangerous aspect of human life. As we said, it is tightly bound up with reproduction. Reproduction cannot be allowed to take place willy-nilly because society would fall apart. It needs to be regulated within family structures. And so you'll find that in any society, if you look anthropologically, right, the family has always been the absolute fundamental institution of society. There is an exception in Western Europe, even before the pre-modern period, where you have the church through certain moral directives, basically breaking apart tribal structures and extended family structures systematically and bringing about a type of individualistic based society, which we are now in the extreme end of in current Western society, where family loses all function and meaning and importance, and the only unit of society and the only unit of analysis is the individual. And again, we have to be aware of that because many of us Muslims growing up in the modern world, particularly in the West, we will just imbibe this sort of fundamental individualism without realizing that we're even doing that, right? We look out and we only see individuals, individual rights, individual, this and that, and we don't think systemically, we don't think in terms of family, we don't think in terms of larger social units. But these larger social units, right, are absolutely vital for the functioning society, even in contemporary Western society and technological society, even more so in, quote unquote, more traditional societies, okay? So because of the centrality of sexuality to reproduction and family, and the centrality of family to society as the most important bedrock institution of society, there's no society or religion at which sexual norms do not stand at the center and are not a major concern. Now, what does this mean? This means that people tend to hold their sexual norms, whatever they are, very strongly. If you're a Muslim, traditional Muslim, and you have a Muslim friend, you are likely to have very strong reactions against something like homosexual behavior. Like, you feel strongly about it. You're not just like, oh, no big deal. You feel strongly about it. If you're a modern Westerner, you might have very strong notions about someone not accepting homosexual behavior, because again, it's a difference in a sexual norm, and those norms tend to be held very deeply and sort of very gutturally, if I can say. They're in the guts, you feel them, okay? Sexual norms in the Sharia, as throughout human history, are tied to family and family law, centrality of family, and therefore of sex and sexual morality to Islam, okay? What I'm also trying to say here is that we need to identify what our paradigm is, what our sexual morality is, and we also need to therefore hold to it very strongly, because it is central to our religion, right? It cannot be the case that, well, Islam is all about tawheed, la ilaha illallah, and sexual morality, society changes, ideas change, this and that, it's all up for grabs. No, absolutely not, right? This is a fundamental part of Islam. It's definitional to the deen, and it's central to who we are as Muslims, and what it means to be a Muslim is to hold on to a particular theological set of beliefs and also a particular moral and ethical framework in general, and the sexual component of that is a very central one. So as we all know, sex outside of marriage, known as Zina, is strictly forbidden in Islam, haram, and it constitutes a major sin known as a kabira, and we'll get to this in more detail later. The reason for this is that it undermines, or one of the reasons is that it undermines one of the fundamental objectives or maqasid of the Sharia, right? So Allah legislates for us, halal, haram, so on and so forth. And then the scholars looked at all of the laws and rules that Allah had promulgated through revelation and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they said, if we look inductively at these laws, we can see that there are several overarching objectives that Allah, for the benefit of humanity, is preserving a number of fundamental things. The first one is religion. Second one is life. Third one is lineage or family, known in Arabic as nasl or nasab. And we're going to come back to this because it's important for our conversation today. Property, intellect, and honor. Okay, each of these have major crimes or sins, crimes/sins associated with them that undercut them. So for religion, it's apostasy. For life, it's murder. Primarily for lineage, it's zina. That's the prime major offense that undermines this particular maqsad or objective. For property, it's theft. For intellect, it's alcohol, drinking intoxicants, because it covers the mind. And for honor, it's slander. Okay, and so we'll come back to it, but just to give a general Shari'i framework. What are the consequences of zina? Obscuring or mixing of lineage, right, which is called khalt and ansab. And so we looked before that one of the major objectives of the Sharia is to preserve not just family. It doesn't say a'ila or usra or something like that, which are kind of become more popular terms in the modern period, right? And today in the West, family is it's up for grabs what family means and what it can constitute or consist of. But Islam is very clear about it. Family is based on lineage, right? It's a natural lineage, which means that natural reproduction lies at the heart of it. Okay, and so zina obscures that, and we'll come back to this in more detail a bit later. It also violates the sanctity of marriage. Why? Because again, if sexuality is confined to marriage, then it means the right to sexual access is one of the fundamental features that defines it. It's like a wall, it's like a paywall between marriage and not marriage. And that means every act of sexual intercourse that takes place outside of marriage is actually chipping away at that norm, right? It is taking what is the right of marriage and what is the exclusive province of marriage, right? And it's like if you get an A if you work hard, right? In school, if I start giving A's to every student, no matter what, well, the A doesn't mean anything anymore, right? So you've destroyed the meaning of it. right? So marriage is defined to a great degree by the permissibility of sexual behavior within it and the prohibition of it outside of that. And to violate that through individual acts of sexual behavior outside of marriage, directly undermines the institution of marriage itself. And when it happens on a social scale, as we've seen in the West since the 1960s, the entire family structure crumbles as a result, right? So it's actually, modern notion, well, it's my individual thing, who am I hurting? It's not harming anyone, it's just my body and, everyone's consenting. No, that's completely irrelevant, right? People don't understand, Allah knows and we don't know, right? Every act is actually chipping away at a fundamental moral norm, which is why all moral systems usually have very strong prohibitions against things like, extramarital sex, right? Breakdown of the family union and eventually of society, grave consequences also for one's personal virtue, right? We don't just look at things in a consequential manner, but also this is a question of one's personal virtue, one's personal honor, right? It's beneath the honor and the dignity of a Muslim to act in such a manner where they would, for example, have something like zina, right? This is a gross act in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we understand that even apart from social consequences, physical consequences, and so forth, right? It has a direct impact on our personal virtue, on our moral character, on our standing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not irretrievable. If we sin, obviously we can repent, right? But this is not to be taken lightly, right? This is a very serious thing. And it is our misfortune, in particular the misfortune of young people, to live in a time and a place where zina is rampant and everywhere and completely normalized and considered no big deal at all, right? It's like considered absolutely no big deal. And this is a complete disaster because it's a huge deal. And in a normal society, you would feel that it's a huge deal because the society would treat it as a big deal, as it used to even in the West until recently. But when we live in a society where it's normalized, it can be very difficult for us to regain, if we've lost it, that sort of, again, visceral sense of repugnance towards something like, illicit sex. But it's something very important to our moral lives. What are the norms that exist in Islam in order to minimize zina, right, due to the gravity of it? Well, as we all know, but it's worth putting it up here just to, again, complete the framework. There should be no physical contact between non-mahrams. Non-mahram is a member of the opposite sex who is not so close to you that marriage between you and that person would be prohibited. So the mahram is your parents, your siblings, nieces and nephews, aunts and uncles, right? This very close family relations, which you are not allowed to marry. Those are mahrams. Anyone outside that, including first cousins and on, and then anyone outside of your family is considered an ajnabi to you, meaning a foreign person not within your mahram. And so you should not have physical contact with that person until you marry one of them, and then they're your spouse, and then you have full rights to physical contact and sexual intercourse and so forth. No khalwa between non-mahrams, right? The Prophet, the khalwa is to be alone in a place where you do not fear unannounced intrusion, okay? So for a man and a woman to be in a place who are not mahrams, right, where they don't fear being walked in upon unannounced, that is called khalwa, and that is haram. The Prophet ﷺ said, whenever a man and a woman are alone, the shaitan is a third of them, the third one of them. He's there. Doesn't mean that we as Muslims believe that every time a non-Muslim friend might say to you, oh, that's crazy, you guys are obsessed with sex. You think every time a man and a woman are alone together, they're just going to hit the floor or something. No, we're not saying that. But the idea is that if this becomes a norm in society, then many, many people will very often be in precarious situations, and many quote unquote accidents will happen. And so to prevent this from happening, Allah says, don't even be in khalwa, and then it'll be impossible to have illicit sex because no one's going to do that in the right mind if they're not secure against being walked in upon, obviously, right? So it's just blocking all the means so that normal people can avoid premarital sex, not just the spiritual and moral heroes, which is in contemporary society, you have to be almost a hero to do that because the means are so available and they're so easy. But Islam, Allah in His wisdom, blocks the means so that normal people can realize this fundamental moral standard. Okay, modest dress and behavior for both men and women, speech and so on and so forth. Okay, so we won't go more into that, but those are the basic norms. So Islamic gender and sexual norms 3. So what are the consequences of? Oh, we did this. Why is it going back? Sorry. Okay. All right, 4, sorry about that. Okay, so is zina the only thing forbidden in the realm of sexuality? All right, now zina specifically, I mean, technically speaking, means sexual intercourse. So it's male-female sexual intercourse, okay? It's a very specific act. Is zina, thus defined, the only thing forbidden in the realm of sexuality? And I hope everyone knows the answer to that, but we'll discover it. So I want to bring out, so there are 2 things. So there's a general principle in fiqh, or in usul al-fiqh, which is that al-aslu fil ashya al-ibaha, that in general things are permissible by default unless they've been specifically prohibited. So we can eat and drink anything, right? Until Allah comes and his messenger come and say, no, don't eat pork, don't drink alcohol, don't eat, meat that's not been slaughtered with the Bismillah said over it. Otherwise, the default status of human actions and of things in the world is that they're permitted, they're mubah, unless they've been specifically prohibited, except when it comes to sexuality. What is the rule? Does anyone know? I'll just give you a second to think about it. But it's basically the opposite rule, right? Al-aslu fil abda', which means sort of the private parts and what's done with them, so sexuality, is tahrim. Al-aslu fil abda' tahrim. Sexual matters are forbidden or haram by default unless specifically permitted, right? So anything sexual is by default impermissible unless there's a specific factor or set of factors or ruling which permits it, which renders it licit or permissible. So what is permitted? Again, just take a minute to think. As a Muslim, you're a Muslim. What is it that's permitted sexually within Islam? And the answer is sexual relations between a man and a woman, one man and one woman, who are bound by an Islamically valid contract, basically a contract of marriage or nikah, okay? That is the single instance, right? The legal contract between a man and a woman who are contractually bound to each other, having certain rights and duties against each other, the man and the woman towards each other. That is the only context in which sexual activity becomes permissible, okay? So what is prohibited then? Again, it's kind of a no-brainer. Everything else, right? What does everything else include? Sexual acts short of intercourse, okay? So again, we don't need to name them, but everyone here is at least in high school, and given where high schoolers' knowledge about these things is today, we don't need to elaborate. So sexual acts short of intercourse. Anal intercourse categorically is prohibited, including in marriage between a husband and wife. This is not permitted. Exposing one's aura to other than one's spouse without need, such as medical. This is the aura in general, including the whole body for the female, other than the face and hands, but particularly the aura al-mughallada, which is the actual private parts themselves, the pudenda, the genitalia, and so forth. Again, in Western culture, very normal for people to change together and shower in locker rooms and stuff. This is completely forbidden in Islam, and a Muslim should avoid such situations. Masturbation, also according to the majority opinion, there's some discussion about it. The reason I put it here is we'll see in the next slide. And also things that systematically threaten to lead to illicit relations, such as gazing, right? Intently at the opposite sex, touching, as we said before, khalwa, immodest speech, dress, and so on and so forth, okay? So moving on, what is the nature of morality and ethics in Islam? This is part of one of the main topics for today. And what can we glean about it from the things that we've just spoken about? So we're looking specifically about sexual morality, but we can draw conclusions about morality more generally, right? So there are 3 main points that I want to make. One is that Allah's command is absolutely fundamental, right? Allah says in the Quran, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. In Surah Al-Dhariyat, I have not created jinn and mankind but to worship me, right? And a major part of worshiping Allah, in addition to praying and making dua and supplicating to Allah and relying on Allah, a major part of worshiping Allah is obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So our first moral duty as human beings is to worship and to obey the one who has created us, the one who has given us life, the one who sustains us at every moment of time and provides us with all our needs, right? That's our fundamental moral duty, is to discern and adhere to the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another important, principle here is Allah and his messenger alone are the legislators of what is right and wrong and what is permitted and prohibited. This is not something that is just up to our opinion. Well, what do you think about this? What's your view on that? This is not the Muslim's vocabulary, right? Our moral questions are framed in terms of what is Allah's hukam or ruling on this matter? What did the Prophet ﷺ bring to us about this matter? Is it halal, haram, in between, you know, this, that? There are different categories, okay? Allah says in the Quran, and I'll read it just in English for the time, it is not for any believing man or woman when Allah and his messenger have decided on an affair to have any choice in their matter, okay? So much for choice, which is fetishized so much by contemporary society. And whoever disobeys Allah and his messenger has manifestly gone astray, okay? So the divine command is absolutely fundamental. And in that sense, we have a sort of divine command ethics, to put it in the terms that are used in contemporary ethical discourse, okay? Consequences matter as well, right? So there is a type of Islamic consequentialism, to use that language. Allah is wise, just, and merciful, and he legislates for us what is best for us, both in this world and the next. So we don't hold that Allah's commands, although they could be, they're not just random taboos. Do this, don't do that, you know, wear red on Thursdays and blue on Saturdays. And no, I mean, Allah could do that. In some aspects of the Sharia, we can't necessarily say, why are there 4 rak'at in dhuhr and 3 rak'at in maghrib and only 2 at fajr? This, okay, we don't know. Allah said it that way, and that's the way it is. But most of, or a great amount of Allah's rulings, we can actually understand the wisdom with our minds, and we can see that Allah is actually legislating for, you know, purposes like the maqasid, the objectives that we discussed. Okay. The last thing we want to say is that virtue and moral character, khuluq or akhlaq in Arabic, the plural, are of paramount importance in Islam. Allah says in the Quran, speaking to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. You, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, are of an immense, you know, you are of an immense noble character, okay, an immense moral character. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, مَا بُعِثْتُ إِلَّا لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I was sent but to perfect the noble traits of character. And then bringing this idea of character and then centrality of character back to our, back to our current topic. All right. Okay, I apologize for that. Bringing it back to our current topic, the Prophet ﷺ also said, every religion has a characteristic khuluq, or a characteristic moral trait. لِكُلِّ دِينٍ خُلُقٍ وَخُلُقُ الْإِسْلَامِ الْحَيَاءُ. Every religion has a characteristic moral trait, and the characteristic moral trait of Islam is modesty, right? So this is fundamentally important in our religion. Muslims are known for their extreme sense of modesty and circumspection when it comes to matters of modesty and sexual matters and so forth and behavior. Okay, it's one of our defining traits. Just like people know Muslims don't drink alcohol, they don't eat pork. This is a fundamental trait of Muslims. Okay, and the Prophet also said, peace be upon him, إِذَا لَمْ تَسْتَحْيِ فَاصْنَعْ مَا شِئْتَ. If you have no shame or modesty, hayat, right, then just do as you please, because it's that hayat that keeps us from evil deeds and from sinful deeds and gross deeds in the eyes of Allah. Okay, how does this all compare to the contemporary moral and ethical framework that we are trying to negotiate, and in terms of which most of our questions are being framed for us and given to us on a silver platter? Here you go. What do you think about this? What do you say about that? And we don't realize that, you know, this is all happening within a particular moral framework. Well, let's look at the 3 things that we just talked about: divine command, consequences, and virtue. Divine command is basically irrelevant, right? We've such a secular society. It became even more secular, particularly in the realm of sexual morality with the sexual revolution, okay? So sexual morality is separated from religion. It becomes thoroughly personal and subjective. Everyone gets to decide, well, I think this about this act and that about that act, and what's your view on this and that, okay? It's purely subjective, or that's the way it's presented, right? Centrality of erzatz notion, erzatz just means replacement. So when you lose religion and God, you have to replace that with something else, right? Because we're born on the fitra to worship Allah and to seek Allah. And if you turn away from that, you're going to look for other things to fill the religious quest. So you have very popular notions which are central to the modern consciousness, like freedom, okay? Islam, however, is based on servitude and submission to God. The name of our religion is Islam, which means submission. Does it mean that we don't like freedom? Of course, we like freedom from our tyrannical governments and oppression and all of this and that. But our driving ethos is not, okay, we're here to be as free as possible. Like I live in Massachusetts, and to the north of us in New Hampshire, the driver's license, it says, the license plate says, live free or die. It's like if you're not free in a radical sense to just do whatever you want, then you might as well be dead. This is completely opposite to our attitude as Muslims and our fundamental orientation towards the world. Also, autonomy, freedom and autonomy, we hear it all over the place. Anyone know what autonomy means? What does autonomy mean? Right? Well, it's coming from the word auto, meaning self, and nomos, meaning law. And so autonomy means to give oneself the law. And I think any Muslim who knows a little bit about Islam, and particularly after the discussions we've just had, right, can see how, in a sense, blasphemous this notion is if you take it in its literal sense. Because why? God and his messenger alone have the right to legislate, right? We don't legislate for ourselves. We are not autonomous. We don't give ourselves the moral law. We're not the source of the moral law, right? It's very important for us to understand as Muslims, particularly in the current climate, okay? Things like authenticity, right? You be you, you do you, this is who I am, right? And you just kind of define in purely subjective terms what it is that makes you you and what's authentic to you, right? From an Islamic perspective, we are only our true authentic selves as human beings when we have found and submitted to our Creator. Everything else is secondary. Yes, we have different skin colors, different languages, different ethnic backgrounds, different proclivities, different interests, different professions. That's all fine. And all of that is part of who we are, quote unquote, authentically, yes, right? But all of that is secondary to who are you as an insan, right? Human beings were created with an objective purpose by God to know and to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And people who don't realize that and don't find and submit to Allah will always be looking for something else to fill that God-shaped hole in the heart with, okay? So that's where we're coming from. Consequences are judged in purely subjective terms, if at all, okay? From our perspective, as we said before, Allah knows our interests better than we do, and he alone has full knowledge of all consequences, right? Allahu ya'lamu wa antum la ta'lamun. Allah knows and you do not know. And Allah is the one who, decides which are the consequences to be taken into account and what are the best ways for those consequences to be accounted for, okay? And then virtue and moral character, where does this fit in contemporary moral discourse? Not at all, right? Virtue is an old-fashioned and quaint term at best in modern parlance. It's often met with derision. Sexual behavior particularly is seen as irrelevant to moral character. As long as what you're doing is consensual and sort of suits your fancy, then how dare anyone sort of judge another person's moral character based on their sexual behavior. This is the current attitude. Of course, from Islam, إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ, on the day when neither progeny nor wealth, the day of judgment, will benefit a person, except for the one who comes to Allah with a sound heart. So virtue, again, absolutely central. So you can see we're coming from a very, very different perspective and paradigm, and we need to get this under our belt before we can, face the issues head on, okay? So let's go on then. How are we doing with time? I turned off my phone so it wouldn't make noises while we're doing it.
Yeah, it's 5:30, but let's give you a few more minutes. Let's do 10 to 15 more minutes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, because
Yep.
inshallah, yeah.
And then we'll break for Q&A and conversation. Okay, good. Yep. So
yeah.
I'll speed through this. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions, but that's fine. That's most of the learning and interaction comes out through the Q&A anyway.
Exactly.
I'm just trying to set the scene. So, okay.
Yes. Okay. All right.
All right. So Islamic sexual and gender norms 5. What does it mean in the Sharia to protect family? Right. We said that one of the the overall 6 goals or 6 things that Allah is protecting: religion, life, lineage, family/lineage, and then property, intellect, and honor. So what does it mean for the Sharia to protect family, right? It's particularly in terms of lineage. So the extended family is normative for, again, most traditional societies, including Islamic society and Islamic religion. If you consider the inheritance laws, when you die, your property is not your own. You can bequeath, as you might know, 1/3 of your estate. You can decide 1/3 of my estate I'm going to give to whatever cause or person, but the rest of it, 2/3 when you die, it's not yours anymore. That's Allah's wealth that he lent to you during your life. It goes back to Allah and it's distributed according to his rules, which distributed to your family members, your extended family. So there, that's very apparent in the Sharia. Also, blood ties through lineage are of prime importance, and therefore natural reproduction. Okay, it is as well known that adopting is not permitted in Islam if by adoption we mean the way it takes place in the West, where a family takes on an abandoned child, for example, and then gives that child their own name, the man's name, and raises it as if that child were born of that man and woman, right? That's not permissible in Islam, because you cannot obscure a person's lineage. If it's not your child, you can't lie to that child and say he's your child, okay? And there are other aspects to this, but it's lineage and natural family ties and natural reproduction which lie at the center of that, which the Sharia is protecting, specifically not just any notion of family that someone might come up with at some time and place. As today, again, radically different notions of what a legitimate family might look like. This is not an option that's available in Islam, right? It's a very specific notion of family that the Sharia is protecting. Consequently, we find that there's a prohibition, this is very interesting, of most means of artificial reproduction, which are considered tantamount to zina, right? So, now you have sperm banks and egg banks and surrogate mothers and so forth. All of this is considered prohibited, except where a married man and a woman have trouble conceiving. Naturally, maybe the woman's fallopian tubes are blocked and so the sperm can never get to the egg, right? The only scenario in which it would be permissible to use in vitro fertilization would be a married man and a woman, his sperm, her eggs, and she carries the baby, so that the end result preserves and protects the natural reproduction that Allah has set up. The child is born, one mother, one father, right? And the woman who is his biological mother has actually carried that child.
Dr. Sharif,
yeah?
people are asking you to speak up.
Okay, all right, I'll speak up, I'm sorry, okay. So outside of that, right, having a sperm donor from outside the married couple or an egg donor from outside the married couple or a surrogate mother from outside the couple is all forbidden because it's considered tantamount to zina. And you say, how is it zina? No one's sleeping with anyone else. No one's having sexual relations. But the idea is, but you're reproducing the consequences of zina, which is that you're mixing the lineage and you're mixing the lines, and you're doing so in this artificial way now where a child is born and can have, 5 parents, a man and a woman who, took a sperm donor, an egg donor, had it fertilized, and then implanted into the womb of another woman who's the surrogate mother. And then they're the ones who commissioned this kind of, production to begin with. And so the baby's born of a anonymous sperm donor, anonymous egg donor. That's the person's physical characteristics. Can't even know who the parents are. The woman who gave birth to him is not the woman who gave him 23 of his chromosomes or her chromosomes. And then the mother and father, man and woman, take him home from the hospital, are not his parents. So what is this? Like, whose child is that? And then the law will arbitrarily say, okay, well, you're the parents and this not. This is completely forbidden in Islam, okay? And so again, it's a particular notion. Further Islamic principles related to gender, okay? And this is getting into some of the current debates. So there are only 2 genders, they're male and female. Allah says in the Quran, وَأَنَّهُ خَلَقَ الزَّوْجَيْنِ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنثَى, as we've seen before. And by his creation of the 2 pairs, the male and the female. And there are many other verses that talk about this. This is true also for the intersex person known in Arabic as the khuntha, which is a person who upon birth has ambiguous genitalia and ambiguous physical features, and it's not clear whether that person is a male or a female. The scholars hold that they still are either male or female. We just don't know which one yet, and there are different ways of trying to find out. And usually you can tell for an intersex individual which one, and there's a lot of detail that we can't get into, but the idea is that, a person is either a male or a female. And intersex, it just means that the actual gender, the binary gender, is actually ambiguous, okay? It's not a third gender. Biological sex and psychological gender, which is a very common modern current distinction to be made since the 1980s, that your sex is your biology, but your gender is sort of your psychological affect and sense of identity. This is not systematically distinguished in Islam. Again, it's a very new kind of recent Western phenomenon, and we'll get back to this later in the next few slides. Also, deliberate imitation of the opposite sex is forbidden, specifically in dress and affectations. There's the well-known hadith of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah has cursed men who deliberately imitate women, and women who deliberately imitate men, okay? This doesn't mean someone who naturally has mannerisms, naturally. That might be a man who's a little bit more feminine or a woman who's more masculine or different interests or things like that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about things that are deliberate under a person's control, right? And this hadith, particularly in Bukhari's book, the Sahih al-Bukhari, he puts it in the chapter on dress, which means specifically, right? No matter what your mannerisms are like or your interests or something like that, right? You choose how you dress. And it is not permissible for a man to dress in ways that are known by the culture, right? And there's a social aspect to it that's called urf, right? Or social custom, right? To dress in ways that are specifically designated as female, or for females to dress or act in ways that are specifically designated as males. By acting, I mean accoutrements and so on and so forth, okay? This is obviously going to be relevant to discussions of transgenderism, but again, it's important to get that principle. Gender transitioning is not something that's recognized, and so-called sex reassignment procedures are also prohibited, right? You cannot, this would involve mutilating the body. It's forbidden in Islam to do that, right? And if there's a misalignment between one's gender identity and one's biology, that is something that we recognize might be faced by people, but that does not mean that it is therefore legitimate to actually change the body physically, especially in irrevocable ways, such as through hormone or surgical treatment, okay? And we can come back to that later. So what about those who fall outside the binary? That's the question that's going to be raised, right? Well, this seems like everything I've just said is like, disaster public relations, right? It's heteronormative, it's, cis normative, it's gender binary, male, female, this and that. Of course, I mean, again, this was just common sense for everybody until very recently when all of this was radically questioned by, again, on the heels of the sexual revolution and sort of all of the forces that were unleashed through it, okay? So what about those who fall outside of the binary in terms of their gender identification? Physically, we already talked about the intersex individual. This has been spoken about by our scholars since the very beginning. Those who fall outside psychologically or who fall outside in terms of their attractions, that they're attracted, say, to the same sex as opposed to the opposite sex, okay? What do we say about this? So we would say, as a normative matter, sex, meaning biological sex, gender identity and expression, and sexual orientation should line up as a normative matter. And by that, I don't just mean statistically normative, which they do line up statistically. I mean, most people with a male body identify as men, act like men, and are attracted to women, and vice versa for women. So statistically, that's normative. But we would say it's also normative in a kind of metaphysical and a moral sense too. It's normative not just because it happens to be the case, but that's the way it, in a sense, should be. That's the right way for it to be, okay? This is different from the gender, what's it called? The genderbread man thing that you guys have seen. I forgot to put it on the slides. They're showing to children now that you have gender, sex, male, female, gender, man, woman, sexual orientation, gay, straight, gender expression, female or male. And that all of these are sliding scales, right? With a bunch of positions in between, and all 3 or 4 of these variables are, again, just free floating variables. And if they happen to line up with one person, that's great. But if they don't need to, and if they don't with someone else, that's perfectly fine as well. And this is what's presented to children now as the norm, okay? Again, completely rejected from an Islamic perspective, just from a conceptual point of view, okay? Now, again, it's important here, exceptions to the rule, people who don't identify with their birth gender, or who don't, find themselves attracted to the same sex other than the different other sex, that does not undermine the rule itself, right? Because there are exceptions doesn't mean that the rule is not a rule, and it doesn't therefore undermine the normativity of the male-female gender binary. Yes, that's normative, it's created by God, right? We have scriptural and empirical evidence for that, right? And that is normative, even if there are people who don't fall within it, it's still normatively the case, right? And we'll not need to be apologetic about that or recraft human language and all of human society as if this were just some figment of our imaginations or some type of social constructionist plot, to oppress minorities or something like that, right? Which is how it's usually talked about. Also, normativity of the expectation of broad conformity to the behavioral norms, specifically dress and conscious mannerisms of one's natal sex or gender, right? Cross-dressing is forbidden in Islam. It's not something we think is okay. Opposite sex attraction and within marriage, opposite sex, sexual expression, so the normativity of that, okay? Okay, well, what if I don't fall within this, right? What if I don't fall within that binary in terms of my identity, or I'm attracted to my own sex? Am I sinful for feeling attracted to my own sex, right? Just feeling attracted, or for not identifying with my own gender? Am I sinful for that? Well, there's a very important Islamic principle, namely, you are morally responsible only for what you have control over, okay? And to the extent that people don't choose not to feel, especially extreme cases of gender, dysphoria, and people don't choose to be, for example, attracted to one gender or another, it's something that they usually discover within themselves. You're not morally responsible for something that you haven't chosen, okay? Which can apply to these sort of internal dispositions, right? So merely experiencing same-sex attractions or merely experiencing gender identity disorder or dysphoria does not in and of itself constitute a sin. That's important to know. However, we are still responsible for our actions, i.e. refraining from haram sexual behavior or haram imitation of the opposite sex, whether it's through what they call social transitioning, through dress and appearance, or more radical forms through hormone or other types of treatment, surgical and otherwise, okay? So moving on quickly so we can end. So what is homosexuality then? The contemporary background. A very important principle that's going to guide the rest of the discussion before the break, before the Q&A, is again a principle in the fiqh, in the usul al-fiqh, al-hukmu ala shay' far'un an tasawwurihi, that basically you can only judge a thing once it is properly conceived. We can only pass judgment on a phenomenon once we've conceived of what it is we're talking about. And it's extremely important when we talk about, again, a lot of these, especially hot button controversial issues, because the terms used really define the whole conceptual framework and they bring a lot of baggage with them, okay? So homosexuality, which is not even a term used much anymore, it's fallen out of disfavor. Now it's LGBT, and I don't use that term for very deliberately. I think homosexuality is more neutral, right? But just to stick with homosexuality for now, in contemporary parlance, it usually refers to three things, right? Feelings of romantic and or sexual attraction to members of one's own sex, okay, feelings. Engaging in romantic relationships and or sexual behavior with members of one's own sex. This is seen to just flow naturally and unobjectionably from the former. I have these feelings and attractions, okay, sex is natural and good, I act upon it, one flows from the other unproblematically, so these kind of flow one from the other. And then thirdly, adopting a personal and social identity based on such feelings and or relationships and acts. Okay, so the term homosexuality or the identity term LGBT, right? It kind of conflates attractions and desires with behavior, with identity, all in one very tightly bound up conglomerated thing to which you are expected to have one reaction either for or against or of acceptance or rejection or whatever it is, okay? This is a problem, this conceptually is a problem, and we'll see why in a second. So as we said, modern culture amalgamates these three into one, coming up with notions like I am gay, lesbian, queer, right? This is something I am, it's my identity. It starts with my desires, my actions naturally flow out of that, and it forms the identity of who I am as a person. It's a thing that I am, okay? This way of looking at sexuality, particularly homosexuality, is very new and it's culturally specific to the modern West. The term homosexuality was first coined in German as Homosexualität in the 1860s. Before that, nobody classified themselves as being gay or straight. I mean, for us, we just take that as like a natural thing, okay? People didn't, you had males and females, some members of both groups, engage in sexual behavior with other members of their own gender, but that's something they did. It was not something they were. There was no separate category in people's minds to put all such people into a category called gay or homosexual across from another category, which was straight people. So even people who didn't engage in such behavior, didn't have such desires, didn't think of themselves even as late as the 1920s in the West as being straight. If you had said, are you straight? They'd say, well, what are you talking about? Like, I don't even have a concept of what you're talking about. So again, we cannot just assume that these categories are kind of, permanent, objective, transcendent features of the universe, right? These people like to talk about social constructionism. This is where it comes in. These are constructive categories, and we need to understand that if we're going to have a productive discussion, okay? Homosexual sentiment and behavior are widely attested in past societies, including Muslim societies, but it was never taken as an identity. This is a big, big departure, okay? It was something you did, not something you were. Again, massive difference with very different implications. And then the elision of any meaningful distinction between desires and actions is morally problematic, okay? To say I feel a certain thing, therefore it must be acceptable for me to act on it. If you apply that across the board, you're going to run into huge moral problems, and it would be a very objectionable premise to adopt, okay? So we can't be, you know, sort of special favors, and only when it comes to like same-sex desires, we all of a sudden throw the principle out the window and assume that the presence of the desires automatically morally justifies the behavior, okay? So as I said, considering homosexuality as a question of identity rather than a question of acts fundamentally alters the entire conversation, okay? So how do we build an Islamic framework to discuss this? And and there's only a few more slides left. Again, our principle, one can only judge a thing once it is properly conceived, okay? Now, there is no single word for homosexuality in the Sharia or in classical Arabic. There's no word, right? Because what it does is it conglomerates three things which no one ever conglomerated before. And we don't do that in Islam. So we don't have a word for a concept that we don't even have to begin with, okay? In modern Arabic, they've come up with, you know, some calques on Western and mithliya, jinsiya, and all of this stuff. But these are new terms that are just translating homosexual. It's not an indigenous term, and it's not one that you find in the Sharia, okay? Another important point, the Sharia addresses acts, not desires, i.e. desires that are beyond one's control, okay? Now, is one responsible for fantasizing, for all? Yes, those are acts of the heart, okay? But the mere fact that you might be attracted to one gender or another, to the extent that that's beyond your control, that's not what the Sharia is addressing. It's addressing acts that you have agency over. People like to talk about agency again. Here you go. Here's where agency comes in, and it's very important, and we don't abdicate it, okay? Islam does not categorize human beings on the basis of mere desires, sexual or other, okay? i.e. a person does not come to be a particular thing or come to constitute a particular class of human beings on the basis of mere desires and inclinations, be they same-sex or otherwise, okay? Islam also does not place human beings into discrete identity categories on the basis of acts. So even if someone is acting on this, which is haram, right? The Sharia doesn't have a term to put that other than to just name them by the behavior. Like you say, sharib al-khamr, the drinker of wine means a person who drinks wine. If he stops drinking wine, he's no longer sharib al-khamr, right? But that's not an identity category. It's just describing the act that you're doing, okay? So even if one's engaged in this type of activity, they might, in the Sharia, okay, the person who does this act, but it's not an identity, okay? Question, what is the best way to answer the question, what does Islam say about homosexuality? What's the best way? I would normally give you a minute to think about it, but I think we're running out of time, so I'll preempt it. Well, we must distinguish between, again, you have to always question the terms, right? Homosexuality, we don't have a direct correspondence to that to begin with, so you need to break it down. You break it down into desires, acts, and identity. These are all separate. What does the Sharia say about homosexual desires? If they're out of your control, you're not morally responsible for them. Although they're not normative, you're not morally blameworthy, okay? The acts are prohibited. And that's irrespective of the fact that you desired or don't desire. And the identity, it doesn't say anything about it, but you know, I would say that it's a bad idea to adopt an identity paradigm. And the next question is then, what are the implications of accepting or rejecting a Western sexual identity framework? And as I've alluded to, you know, adopting an identity framework changes the discussion completely. It elides moral concerns. And it frames the issue, because once it becomes a question of who I am, then if you start saying, well, wait a minute, I just want to talk about the morality of the behavior. If I've made that behavior part of my fundamental identity, then your questioning of the behavior or the religion's questioning of the behavior is now seen as a threat to my very existence. It's a threat to who I am, right? And so you're not allowed to talk about the moral issue, which is why no one asks anymore, what do you think about homosexuality? In the 80s, people said that, and they meant, it was understood that you were asking, what does the person think about the morality of the acts? And most people would have said, no, it's immoral, like that, okay? But now to even assume that the question is legitimate is is unacceptable because they've equated it to race, equated it to skin color. So it'd be saying like, well, what's the morality of having a particular skin tone? Like that's absurd. There's no morality involved in having a particular skin tone. But when you make homosexuality, desires, acts, and identity all one, right? Any discussion of any one of those three aspects comes to be seen as an attack on identity. And therefore it becomes reframed as an issue of social justice defined subjectively, right? As opposed to a question of what is Allah's command, which itself embodies perfect justice. Allah is the adl, okay? So building up the Islamic framework, again, our principle, one can only judge a thing if it's been properly conceived. How does the Sharia classify sexual acts, right? Because it's not talking about desires, not talking about identity, it's talking about acts. Well, there's halal and haram acts, okay? That's the basic criterion of distinction. Halal sexual acts are those between a married man and a woman, minus, as we said, even for them, anal intercourse, also intercourse during the woman's menstrual cycle, okay? But other than that, halal. Haram, everything else, we've seen this before. Haram acts are further subdivided into what? Gay and straight? No, we don't have that distinction actually. You don't have terms for it. Same sex, opposite sex, those are not categorical distinctions made, right? The next distinction of haram act are kaba'ir and non-kaba'ir. Kaba'ir are gross enormities. And specifically it's male-female zina, which is penetrative intercourse between a man and a woman who are not married, and male-male liwat or sodomy, which is again, penetrative intercourse between two males. These are kaba'ir. And then you have other prohibited sexual acts, which are non-kaba'ir, okay? I don't say sagha'ir because they're not small, but they're just not considered gross enormities, right? So non-kaba'ir sexual acts are all non-penetrative forbidden sexual acts, okay? Including all other sexual acts. And there is a specific word for two women having sexual, relations with each other. It's called sihaq, from the Arabic word sahaqa, which means to grind, literally. And so it's like female genital grinding, basically. Okay, so that act has a particular name, just as the male sort of counterpart, male intercourse, anal intercourse, sodomy has also a name, liwat. Okay, but again, this is naming acts, not individuals. It's naming acts. Okay, all of these acts, zina, liwat, sihaq, and every other type of non-permitted sexual act are what are called in the Sharia muharram li dhatihi, meaning that they're intrinsically prohibited. They're prohibited for their own sake. The acts themselves are prohibited. Okay, and then you have preludes to prohibited acts, also haram, which we've seen before, such as touching a non-mahram, gazing. Allah says, yaghuddu min absarihim, let them lower their gazes, khalwa, so on and so forth. These are prohibited because they're preludes to these other acts that are prohibited in and of themselves. And so these are called muharram li ghayrihi, prohibited on account of another, because they lead to that which is prohibited intrinsically, meaning the first category. So this is a category that this Sharia makes. It has a name for male-male intercourse, has a name for female, but when it comes to non-penetrative acts in general, it doesn't systematically distinguish between same-sex and opposite sex, but rather between prohibited and non-prohibited, okay? Some questions that come up, which again, I guess we can probably take these up more in the question and answer. Distinguishing being gay or being queer or something like that, which is the current Western identity paradigm, right? From a different paradigm, which talks about, okay, having, for example, same-sex attractions. Here, you're not amalgamating the three. You're leaving attractions, actions, and identity are separate. And someone usually discovers the attractions. Okay, so I have same-sex attractions. I'm a Muslim first and foremost. That's my identity. I'm a son of Adam or daughter of Adam. I'm a male or a female. I'm a part of the Islamic Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's my identity, right? Now, I have or experienced this. I'm not morally responsible for it, so I've not done anything wrong, okay? Actions are a different thing, but this is a very different way of approaching it than just sort of the identity paradigm, which is really the only way most of us know how to think about homosexuality, because that's the only paradigm that's been given to us, okay? Where does homosexuality or same-sex attractions come from? The common notion, okay, we're born gay, someone's born gay. There's no scientific evidence for this. There's been no gay gene that's been found. A major study was published just 2 years ago, synthesizing hundreds of different studies. Scientists basically do not have any idea. And most likely it seems that there could be some type of genetic predisposition to certain behavioral patterns, but then with a substantial also known through psychological research, which is taboo, on this issue, a number of psychological and environmental factors that usually take place in early childhood, right? Probably some type of combination of these two will lead to a sort of adolescent or adult experience of exclusive or primary same-sex attractions. Can homosexuality be quote unquote cured or overcome? Big question. There does not seem to be evidence that it's very likely or very common that someone who has a strong and persistent sort of same-sex attraction can just flip to a exclusive or predominant opposite sex one, although it may be possible to diminish it, it may be possible to learn to deal with it, learn to control one's actions and behaviors, learn to kind of accept that aspect of oneself and move on and so forth. The psychological models equate homosexual desires with often with childhood traumas, with incomplete kind of gender identification issues and so forth. And to the extent that this is true, again, as Muslims, we don't have to take a definite opinion, position on one or the other as a theological matter, but just to know that the discussions are out there. To the extent that homosexual attractions are seen as being symptomatic of underlying issues, if that's actually the case, then it would be it would probably help someone to try to discover what those issues might be, because they're probably suffering from a lot of other, issues in terms of trauma, in terms of bullying, in terms of self-identity and so forth, which, could be addressed even if the same-sex attractions are not completely overcome or overcome at all. It could be profitable to address some of those other, concomitant issues that are very often and statistically often come along with people who experience same-sex attractions. Can someone with same-sex attractions ever hope of marrying Islamically, i.e. in opposite sex, and having a family? This is possible. There is not one, again, it's not black and white. And there are different cases, there are different scenarios, different people experience this phenomenon to different degrees and in different ways. And for some, there might be an absolute rejection and aversion to the opposite sex. Others, there might not be, and it might be more conceivable to actually have a successful marriage, even if one has also attractions for one's own gender and so forth, right? There's a lot of nuance that gets lost mostly in the public discussion because it's become so politicized, but that as Muslims we need to be aware of if we're going to have a mature and a religiously faithful also discussion on this topic, okay? How best to deal with individuals who experience same-sex attractions inside our communities and families. Again, I think the best way is if we just start with our paradigm, Allah's paradigm, the wise paradigm, right? The attractions are one thing. If a person has not chosen them, they are not morally blameworthy. There is no grounds for rejecting a person. There's no grounds for turning a person out, for saying, I'm not going to talk to you anymore if someone comes to you with this. To the contrary, right? This is a very difficult thing for someone to deal with, especially, okay, you're Muslim and you're not in an environment where this is something, acting on this is acceptable and it's a taboo. We don't speak about it much. So if someone actually opens up to you and says, we're very close friends, or you're my brother in Islam, and I have this really deep issue that I've been struggling with, I want to talk to you about it, and they open up to you, that person is being extremely vulnerable, and they're putting themselves on the line because they have no idea how you're going to react, and it's a huge risk. And the worst thing you could do is, get out of here, that's disgusting, whatever, right? That person literally needs to be embraced, literally. Because, again, having read a lot about this topic, almost you can bet your bottom dollar that person was probably somewhat gender nonconforming as a child, was probably bullied the heck out of because of that, probably has dealt with a lot of emotional issues and turmoil for their whole life. Okay, models which see, this as being seated in troubled relationships with a parent of the same gender. The person probably has like a bad relationship with the parent of the same gender, not always, but very, very high, like statistically, it's very often the case, okay? They probably never fully identified as like a boy among other boys or girl among other girls, which led to other psychological and social issues. So the person's probably been through a whole lot, right? When they come to you opening up this huge kind of dark secret, that's a very vulnerable thing to do. And we need to know that this is not just a simplistic phenomenon. Oh, Qawm Lut, that's haram, that's disgusting. Of course, the acts themselves, they have the status they have in the Sharia, we're not denying that. But the phenomenon of a person being primarily attracted to his or her own sex instead of the other, this is something that we don't yet understand fully. You know, we're still coming to understand it, but we do know that it's something that people don't in general choose, right? Although now people are experimenting a lot, that's different. But I'm talking about someone who's like just discovered this inside and is like horrified to discover, and you know, they tried to pray it away and so on and so forth, and it didn't change, and they don't know what to do, right? We need to know how to deal with people sensitively, with compassion, with, you know, principle also, right? And to give them the support that they need, okay? However, we have to distinguish this. This is when someone's coming and they want to live within the deen, right? This is to be distinguished from people who come as an activist and say, no, I'm gay and this is who I am, okay? I've adopted this identity, and you need to change the religion, or we need to change the religion. We need to change Allah's command. We need to change our spaces and put a, you know, a rainbow flag up and say all are welcome. And so that, you know, we don't quote unquote stigmatize, again, this is the identity paradigm. Don't stigmatize, you know, sexual minorities within the community by erasing their relationships and not accepting their behavior and so on and so forth, right? You get the whole identity paradigm, which just crams all of this stuff into one thing and then demands sort of a full acceptance on pain of the community being accused of, you know, bigotry, insensitivity, so on and so forth. This is very problematic for the reasons we've said. And so Muslim, you know, and there's a lot of pressure, more and more, including from some people who identify as Muslims, who are starting to push this agenda very heavily onto the community. And the community really needs to be very aware of this and not fall into this type of, you know, pressure that comes with this kind of rhetoric based on that paradigm, which that's one of the reasons why it is so problematic. Also just traps the person within that identity also, and makes their identity very much about sexual desires and affect rather than about other issues. How best to deal with a non-Muslim colleague, classmates, and so on when it comes to this issue. The same way we deal with everybody else in the society who might have beliefs that we consider or that we know to be wrong. People are atheists, they're polytheists, they're, you know, Christians who believe Jesus is God and so forth. We deal with people with, you know, dignity, respect, so on and so forth. We don't therefore, you know, say that we condone or what they actually believe if we know that to be wrong. People engage in all types of, you know, Zina and other types of behavior too. We don't approve of their acts. We don't join them in it. We don't normalize it. But when we deal with them as colleagues and classmates, we treat them decently as we would anybody else, as we're commanded to in our religion. And when it comes to people who openly identify as gay or lesbian or queer or something like that, it's the same. We treat them with the same dignity that we would anyone else, the same respect, but it doesn't mean that we, you know, approve or give signs of approving, you know, and there can be issues that maybe we can talk about later, some, you know, details here and there, but that's the general. How can Muslims deal with the cultural and political pressures stemming from this issue in the public square? Again, I think I'll probably stop now, and then we can open up for Q&A. Just a few resources that I'd like to leave you with. There's an excellent article published by Muslim Matters, I believe 2015, maybe 2016. It's called From a Same-Sex Attracted Muslim, Between Denial of Reality and Distortion of Religion. It is written by a brother named Brother Yusuf. He is the moderator of an online anonymous support forum for Muslims, men and women, who experience same-sex attractions, but who are living or endeavoring to live according to the deen of Allah and are accepting Islamic, you know, rulings on same-sex behavior and are struggling to remain faithful to that, you know, but are seeking help to do that. And he wrote this beautiful article talking about, okay, this is a reality and we need to face it as a community. We need to know what it's all about. We need to know how to support our brothers and sisters dealing with this phenomenon, but we also need to do it in a principled way without distorting the clear teachings, you know, of Islam. Then there's a podcast that just began last year, A Way Beyond the Rainbow. 40 episodes out so far, another 30 or 40 coming up this year. This covers everything under the sun that you could possibly want to know about this issue. Also from the perspective of a faithful, you know, Muslim who deals with this issue from a faithful perspective, meaning a perspective staying within the Islamic framework, not one that goes beyond that. So check that out. Many of the questions that come up are dealt with in this thing. And then 2 pieces by Brother Mubin Vayed, Can Islam Accommodate Homosexual Acts? Quranic Revisionism in the case of Scott Kugel, a very important article to read, very extensive, talks a lot about frameworks, paradigms, also the case that someone has tried to make for homosexual relations within Islam. You know, a whole book was written on this, and when you read this, you realize how much kind of dishonesty and deception goes into trying to make those arguments that really play on the assumed ignorance of the readership. And it's important for Muslims to understand how these kind of tricks are played so that people are not, kind of taken advantage of. And then 2 very important articles on the whole question of nonconformity, gender nonconformity, and transgenderism, and the male is not like the female, Islam and gender nonconformity, parts 1 and 2. Part 1 is about 20 pages. It came out in 2017. Part 2 just came out last December. It's 80 pages. Very, very extensive study based on tons of sources. And then Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad has priceless essays. I didn't put the actual titles here, but you can Google him. There are 2 articles on gender, which I think are a must read and a prerequisite for any Muslim discussion on gender issues in general, male, female, the Sharia, differences between males and females, and so on and so forth. And he engages with contemporary feminist literature and scientific literature as well. And then he has one on the family called The Fall of the Family. So all of these I would strongly recommend that, youth and teachers and parents and so on and so forth to check out. And the podcast particularly also has many other resources in each episode. The episodes also have transcripts, so you can read and skim through them if you don't want to listen to the whole thing. And resources are given at every episode as well. So I'm sorry I went way, way beyond, but again, it's a huge topic. And if you don't give it its right, it's kind of not something that you can just do half-baked. There's still many things that have not been said, many questions that can come up, but I hope that I did an adequate job of sketching at least the broad frameworks. And I look forward to taking your questions and engaging in discussion. So jazakumullahu khair. والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
All right, Jazakallah khair, Dr. Sharif. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break. Y'all can all get your questions in. If you haven't already, that would be a good time to do so. Get a glass of water, walk around a little bit. And inshallah, we will be back here at 6:15 to do some more Q&A. And yes, thank you so much, Dr. Sharif, for all of the information. It's really important for us to have all of these definitions and know all of the terminology so that we actually know what we're talking about here. That sort of foundational education is really important when discussing these issues. So jazakallah khair, everybody. We will see you back in 5 minutes. And inshallah, we will have the Q&A there. So please submit your questions to the form and see you in a little bit.
Okay, I'm here. I was just glancing through the chat.
Yes, assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome back. Okay, so we have some questions in the chat. Let's see. Dr. Sharif, is there one that you want to take?
Well, no, I'm just right now I'm reading, it seems like mostly comments. Were questions posted directly to the chat, or was there a separate form for questions to be posted?
Yes, I can read you a few. So we had some questions come in beforehand, and let me see which ones we haven't actually gotten answers from your talk yet. So one question is, if a Muslim does engage in a homosexual relationship, does that mean that they're automatically going to hellfire? That's one of the questions that we have.
So, I mean, engaging in such a relationship is prohibited. If it includes, you know, sexual acts and so forth, those are very serious, particularly the ones that, you know, we've discussed the kind of breakdown of that. However, we don't ever say about any act that a single act or series of acts automatically lands a person in the hellfire. Because in the end of the day, Allah judges a person based on the totality of their life. However, you know, we fear that if someone is committing a major sin and doing so on a consistent basis, that would definitely, you know, that they would definitely run that risk by doing that, particularly since we know, especially if a Muslim dies, this is just a general principle, if a Muslim dies having committed a kabira, specifically a kabira without having repented from it, then that person is, you know, Allah can forgive the person, but can also punish the person. The person can actually go to hellfire for some time to make up, you know, to pay for the sin or sins that were not repented among the major sins, even if they're eventually let out and into paradise. Because as we know, no believer, a person who dies with La ilaha illallah in their heart, will remain forever in hellfire. This is the position of our theology. But Muslims should not be complacent, because they can go to hell, particularly if they die with a kabira that they have not repented for. So we don't make light of the act, but at the same time, we can't say about a particular act, okay, if you do this particular act, then you die, you will definitely go straight to hell. And it's not just sexual acts. We don't say that about any act in general, because again, people, unless they do the act and die right away and didn't have a chance to repent, I mean, people, always the door of repentance is open. The person can change their life. They can come out of that lifestyle. They can, you know, adopt a different course. They can, you know, repent of their past deeds, and they might end up as one of the greatest of Muslims. I mean, it's entirely possible. So.
Okay, I hope that answers whoever asked that question. Another very common thing right now, because we are living in a time where there's a lot of activism going on, a lot of campaigns on social media talking about people's rights and things like that. One person asked this question in the chat, and people have asked this previously, with the LGBTQ movement identifying themselves as a minority, and the Muslim community also identifying itself as a minority, how do you balance rights for one without acknowledging rights for the other, like marriage or the freedom to wear the niqab? So what do we do in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that comes up a lot, and the way you phrased it is a way that it's normally put out as a very sort of straightforward, simple, seemingly obvious, you know, principle. Well, shouldn't everyone get rights? And isn't it hypocritical to, like, you know, advocate some rights and not others, or rights for some and not others? I think that that's a simplification of the issue. Again, a lot of it has to do with the framing. One has to look at issues on an issue by issue basis, right? Because when it comes to something like, I mean, first of all, the question of gay marriage is not, it's a moot point right now, because the issue has been decided in 2015 with the Obergefell decision by the Supreme Court. So we're not asked, no one's being asked to weigh in on that question anymore, because it's been decided, right? But as a question of principle, before it was passed, and I'd like to just point out to people that, you know, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were against gay marriage until like 2012 and 2013, or 2013 and 14 respectively. I forgot which one changed first. I think Obama as soon as his second term started, and then Clinton after. These are Democrats who less than a decade ago were comfortable saying publicly, we believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, right? LGBT community should have rights that are similar to marriage in X, Y, and Z. They went on and on, but marriage is between a man and a woman, right? Forget about Republicans. These were liberal Democrats, okay? And then just a couple years later, after this decision was passed and a new consensus kind of emerges, I would say is kind of imposed and, emerges after this decision was made by the Supreme Court, all of a sudden Muslims somehow take it for granted that it's just like obvious as the light of day, that any reasonable person would just come to the conclusion, well, of course there should be gay marriage. Like, how could there not be? Wouldn't that be discriminatory? And it's like 10 years ago, most of the country didn't think that way, right? And 7 years ago, many Democrats didn't think that way, right? So we have to take a step back and look again at the larger issue. What is it that is at stake in this type of question? And back before Obergefell passed, there was a community-wide or a nationwide or a culture-wide discussion on issues about what is marriage, right? That's an issue that goes beyond homosexuality, right? What is marriage? Because whether you can have a gay marriage or not, whether that even makes any conceptual sense, it depends on what marriage is. And what marriage is depends on what its function is, if any, and where the function is derived, right? And how people come to a consensus on that. And what is the nature of family? And what is the nature, for example, of things that we've talked about that are very important for us as Muslims and that we would hold are central to human life, like having a mother and a father, and having, parents that you're actually related to, and, right? And the fact that men and women are complementary and different and not interchangeable, and therefore mothers and fathers are not interchangeable, right? There's tons of ethical questions that come up and a lot of deep lying assumptions, 5, 6, 7 major assumptions and presuppositions and moral principles, all of which are contestable, all of which people argue about. But you have to sort of relinquish 5, 6, 7 fundamental commitments that we have and others have had in order for the idea of gay marriage to even make conceptual sense, right? And for the political argument also to be coherent. Because a political argument is one of discrimination. Discrimination means that you should not treat two things differently that should not be treated differently. That there's no good reason to treat differently. That's what it means. Otherwise, we quote unquote discriminate all the time, right? You have to be qualified to get a job. You have to be a certain age in order to drive, so that's age discrimination. But we don't call it that because we all understand that there are perfectly good reasons why a 12-year-old should not be able to drive a car, for example, right? So all I'm saying is that to even come to the point where the issue is conceived of as nothing but a straightforward question of, okay, are you for equality or you're for bigotry or like against treating people equally, right? For it to even be phrased that way and for that to even make sense means that you've already come to the decision that all of the relevant differences that we've talked about throughout this talk, in which I just summarized now a few minutes ago, all of the things that make marriage what it is, has traditionally been, that make the male-female relationship what it has been, that imbues sexuality with the meaning that it's had, and traditionally that it has in Islam, it presupposes that you've agreed to sort of relinquish all of those and sort of flip your position and change to the opposite view on all of those, such that, yeah, there's nothing left. There are no fundamental, real, significant differences between, say, a heterosexual and a homosexual relationship on any level, such that it then just looks like arbitrary discrimination because the grounds for why you would or why the law would have an interest or the country would have an interest in preserving and protecting one type of family over another definition of family, right? Those grounds have been removed. And then it's just presented as a case of, discrimination, unjustified, based on nothing but, again, buzzwords come, bigotry, hatred, animus, blah, blah, all of this other stuff, right? So for Muslims not to understand that that's the kind of game that's being played, and that's the rhetorical move that's being made, and to just jump onto these simplistic arguments of like rights and equality and they're a minority and we're a minority and this and that, that's, you know, that's a very superficial way to approach it. That's my opinion, right? What white rights are we asking for? And on what basis? And what rights are or were, for example, groups asking for when they were asking to change the entire definition of marriage against the will of the majority of the population, by the way, right? And are those commensurate or not, right? And can any group just come and just demand any right, and then because it's a group that's statistically a minority asking for a right, all of a sudden it just gets like, what's the word I'm looking for? It gets promoted into being a question of quote unquote minority rights with no distinction as to what's being demanded and on what grounds and how that affects anything else in society, right? And again, people don't like this comparison, but you know, there are discussions about whether the laws forbidding incest should be abrogated. Because the idea is, well, that's a moral law, it comes from Christianity, it's just a taboo, there's no reason, the secular state has no business, you know, telling consenting adults what they want to do in their own bedrooms. Same arguments that were made back before when they were challenging laws against homosexual behavior, same thing. Because those used to be prohibited too on the grounds that they were immoral and therefore shouldn't be tolerated in society because it would have bad moral effects if they became acceptable and widespread. And now when it comes to incest, so people say, well, okay, but there's birth defects. All right, well, what if they're both sterile? Now that we have gay marriage, what if it's two brothers or two sisters? You don't have that issue. Most people would say, yeah, but still, there's something wrong about it. But you can't give a secular reason for that. And if you push it hard enough, and if enough people felt strongly enough about the issue and wanted to get the government out of our bedrooms, and you know, what kind of medieval hangover is this for the government to be, you know, legislating sexual behavior of private individuals and all of this? I mean, are Muslims also going to jump, like, is it conceivable today that in 15 years or 10 years or 20 years, if this were hypothetically to become like a public issue, is it reasonable, or do we Muslims think today that we would be pleased to look forward and see our community in 10, 15 years kind of rallying for the so-called right to incest on the grounds that, okay, well, this is a minority issue? So I think that framing of it is extremely, you know, problematic. Second point too, is that, you know, it's true that, so the LGBT community has expressed support for the Muslim community at particular junctures, particularly after the passing of the Muslim ban under Trump the first year, okay? But at the same time, you have to look at the substantive issues, right? It's not just because someone stood up for a particular right of yours that you would stand up for any right of anyone else, no matter what it is, without making any type of discrimination based on your own moral framework. So I remember 20 years ago, before, you know, when this was still much less of a kind of hot issue as it is today, one scholar came, you know, who's Palestinian originally, who's big in Palestinian activism, and he came to speak at our university about, you know, Palestinian activism and so forth. And someone asked the question, oh, especially in the area he lived, there were a lot of, you know, homosexual groups, LGBT, and they used to come out and support the Palestinian cause. And they said, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that you guys have to go now and march in the gay pride marches? And he said, no, of course not. And he said, everyone understands where we stand on that issue. They understand our moral framework, and, you know, that's it. There is not a reciprocity expectation when it comes to principles. And, you know, when they come, it's an issue by issue basis. When you come, if you're part of an LGBT group or you're an individual who identifies, you know, as LGBT, and you go to march for Palestinian rights, it's because you independently believe in the independent validity of that cause. It's not because you expect Palestinians to turn around and do you a favor, or the group who organized the march to therefore turn around. It's not quid pro quo. The idea is that you're going to support a cause that you actually believe in. So everyone who believes in Palestinian rights, come and join the Palestinian march. You're LGBT, you're whatever, you're atheist, okay, it doesn't matter. You agree with this cause, you come and you support it. Now, There's a march to radically redefine marriage, family, and so forth, and create legal categories. Okay, if you agree with that and believe in that, and that's part of where you stand in terms of your overall worldview, your framework, your moral commitments, what you think based on that is good for society, by all means, go. I mean, in this society, you're free to go and join the march. If I'm not saying go and do it, but you're free to go and do it. But if that doesn't line up with what you think, right, it aligns with your moral vision, you're under no obligation to go and do that. And I think it's important that Muslims realize that, because, otherwise you're constantly being asked to leave your moral framework at the door and to go and not just tolerate, but now to endorse and sign on to and promote things that go deeply against your own commitments, or should go deeply against your own commitments. And nobody actually lives a bifurcated life like that. People who are secular, more liberal, they don't leave their moral values at home when they go out into the public sphere. I mean, it's their moral values that define the public sphere. And they're constantly trying to enact legislation in order to align with that particular vision of the human being, that particular vision of society, that particular vision of morality, all of which is very secularized and individualistic and so forth, right? They don't leave their moral commitments at the door. They go out and act in the public sphere based on those commitments. And it doesn't make sense, and it's not fair to ask religious people, just because they have a religious worldview, that they alone should leave their commitments at the door and act in a completely different way in the public realm. So I'll just end by saying, you think of an issue that's clear cut for you, that you don't think Muslims should ever sign on to, no matter who's calling for it, because it just is too violative of our moral principles. And then you think of an issue that's ambiguous, and you try to figure out whether, if the issue of LGBTs, for example, marriage, is ambiguous for you right now, is it due to something intrinsic to the issue? Because it was not ambiguous to any Muslim half a decade ago, let alone a decade ago. Or is it ambiguous just because the political climate around us has changed, and therefore it's just less, it's less comfortable and more inconvenient for us to sort of express an opinion which has now come to be seen as unpopular.
Right.
And if that's the case, then I think we also have to ask, as a Muslim community who's defined by our principles and our values, if that's an appropriate criterion to use when we are articulating our positions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much for that answer. Let's go to the next question. I think this is definitely from a parent. Their child is in high school, and they say, I see in Muslim high school kids, they understand and believe that acting out one's gay tendencies is a sin. They know and understand and believe this. At the same time, when they see someone come out or in a same-sex relationship, they make comments like, I'm happy for them that they're happy. How do we as parents reconcile these two different things we see in our kids? What are we supposed to say to them when they make these comments? How do we as Muslims advise our kids about having gay or gender fluid friends? My daughter thinks it's okay to be friends with a gay boy because he's safe.
Yeah. Well, so for the first question, I think that, maybe have them, watch this presentation or go through the concepts with them, right? Because the idea is that again, it's hard to grasp this because we live in a very relativistic culture, right? Where there is no truth, essentially, except, obviously there is truth on certain issues that are relevant to people, in which case, there no kind of dissent is really tolerated. But the idea is that a lot of these issues that we might care about, there's considered to be no truth on. And so we have to realize that we are not relativistic in that sense. Allah says in the Quran, La ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion. You cannot force any other person to become a Muslim, right? That's always how that verse has been understood. But then Allah goes on to say immediately after, in the same verse, فَقَدْ تَبَيَّنَ الرُّشْدُ مِنَ الْغَيِّ, because right guidance stands out clearly now from error. So there is right guidance and there's error, there's right and there's wrong, there's truth and there's falsehood. And that's absolutely fundamental. We are Muslims because we hold Islam to be true. That is why we're Muslims. It should be why. Maybe if we're just Muslims out of taqleed, because our parents are Muslim and our community are Muslim, and we could have easily have been born into any other community and would be happy following the religion of that community, that's not sufficient. That is not why we're Muslim. We're Muslim because we have grounds to hold and to believe, and we do hold and believe that Islam is actually true. And if that's the case, then we know that Allah it's something that's directed to all of human beings, all humanity from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, until the day of judgment. This is a universal call to every human being. And it's our job to, represent that and to, call people to that in the appropriate ways and so forth. And we know, again, as we said before, that Allah is the one who legislates. He's the one who commands and prohibits. And he does so based on his knowledge, his wisdom, his mercy, right? For his creatures and his concern for our well-being, both in this life and in the next life. So any action that Allah has prohibited, especially one that he's prohibited strictly and rigorously and has defined as something very grave, right? Is something that we, if we are really are Muslims, then we would know that this is not something that is going to lead to that person's benefit, either in this world or in the next world, right? They are going down a path that is not going to lead them to a good end. And therefore, to be happy for someone to have found a path that is leading them towards a bad end is inconsistent. How could you be happy for a person if they say, there was an academic list, it's kind of defunct now for, and I'll just say self-identifying Muslims who are in the academy, many of whom, especially in Islamic studies, are, disaster cases. But anyway, that's a different, topic. But there was one person on that list who actually apostatized from Islam and converted to Christianity and said on the list, I've left Islam and I've, become, and there were other Muslims, and I'll put it in quote, like self-identifying Muslim, actually congratulating this person. I mean, I'm just taking it to the logical conclusion. Oh, we're so happy for you. You found what works for you. You found your spiritual home, blah, blah, blah. Right? I mean, what is this? Like that this is not, this is not imaginable that anyone who understands what basic Islamic aqidah entails could say that, right? That makes no sense whatsoever. So I would say that our youth who are saying things like this, are probably, at least until now, they are taking Islam more as an identity than as a religion. Or if they take it as a religion for them means a private, personal, affective thing that is tied to your background and community, and not something that is, and it is those things, right? But it's much more than that. They're not understanding it yet as something that is an actual affirmation of truth. It's very unpopular to claim that you believe that something's true these days, right? Objectively true, like true in and of itself. Even if all the Muslims died, Islam would be true because it's Allah's revelation. It's a haqq. It has nothing to do with who believes in it or not, right? So that is a basic aqeedah issue. And I think our youth, we have to be, if your friend came and said, oh, I'm taking drugs and I think I'm addicted, you're not going to be, no one's going to say, oh, I'm so happy for you. You must be really living it up and having a great time at, smoking weed and all of that, right? You have to say, oh, are you sure that's a really good idea? That has, and it's because people understand, they see very clearly the ill effects of things like drugs and alcohol, and it makes sense to them, quote unquote, why Allah has prohibited these things. But when it comes to sexual behavior, homosexuality in particular here, because of the radical change in the social environment around us and the radical change in the paradigm and the presumptions, right? It's no longer intuitive to people what's wrong with this kind of behavior. And a lot of the actual problems that come up, both in terms of physical dangers and harms, particularly for males who engage in this type of behavior, let alone emotional issues, let alone spiritual. I'm talking about things that even a materialist could understand, right? Those things are usually hidden. They're not talked about. It's taboo to mention them because it's like stigmatizing a community and so on and so forth. And so again, all of the intuitions have been overridden by the paradigm. And a lot of the, some of these issues, which are real issues within some of these communities, are not really discussed. And so you're just given a kind of very in a sense, sanitized idea of what it means to kind of live this type of lifestyle. Again, especially for males, because there's an extremely high rate of promiscuity among, gay males or gay identifying males. Very, very high. If you look at statistics, it's like very, very high, right? And there's a lot of like going from one to the next and so forth. And like that's just not healthy. Even if it were opposite sex, I mean, no one would accept that type of behavior as being something normal or healthy. But now we have like a gay exceptionalism. When it comes to homosexuality, you're not allowed to say anything because now that's a person's identity and you're being homophobic and this and that. And even to point out like objective facts about X, Y, or Z is considered off limits. So. You're muted, sister.
Okay. What I was saying is thank you so much for answering that question. I hope that person got that answered adequately. And let's go to something that's a little more practical. Someone asked, am I supposed to call someone by their preferred pronouns, or if they have a different name, like a feminine name, but they are male, should they call them by that name? So
yeah, that's a very difficult question. I'm not sure I have a definitive answer. By doing so, you're kind of conceding the point that, oh, so-and-so really is a male, or really is a female, when according to the Sharia, they're not. Like, you can't actually change your gender. You can mimic the opposite sex through hormone treatment or, physically through your body, but you're not actually now a female, right? So for us, when I say trans women are women, they're not according to the Sharia, right? So by kind of agreeing to use the pronoun, and you're sort of conceding that, okay, now you actually are a female, and that has implications. So like from a strictly just like logical position, one would want to say no, but socially speaking, like that's very tricky because people do like identify, again, identity has come to be conflated with these types of issues. And so someone can feel extremely offended and like, devaluated or whatever if you don't respect the pronoun that they've chosen. And it can also get you into actual like, trouble in workplaces and so forth, because, and even I think New York City, even in public, like to mispronounce someone is now considered a crime, right? So, I mean, pragmatically speaking, I would probably just counsel someone to be, on a case-by-case basis, be pragmatic in the way one is able to interact with others in a way that is respectful of them without causing undue offense. But at the same time, realizing that it's also not just innocent, so to speak, metaphysically speaking, to just kind of play with language like that. Or to speak, and one thing that I would, where do you draw the line? Like now they'll start saying things like pregnant people, because the idea is, well, trans women are women, trans women are biologically males. So not all women menstruate, because not all women have a vagina, that type of thing, because trans women are women. And so you can't say women who menstruate, or women when they're menstruating. You're supposed to say menstruating people, or people with penises, because not all men have a penis and not everyone with a penis is a woman. I mean, like I've actually read and heard this before. It's out there. And Harvard University put out like a guideline for sensitivity in the workplace. And they showed a man, they showed a woman, and then they showed a face of a man with a beard and everything, and then pregnant, right? And so this is now being normalized that, men can give birth. And of course we cannot, this is absurd. It's not true. And this is like, George Orwell. I mean, this is Orwellian to talk about, men on their periods and he just gave birth to a baby. I mean, this is not something that 10 years ago, these phrases had never been spoken before in human language by anybody, right? And so this is a sense of, this is falsehood. This is using language to speak falsehood. And I think that Muslims should definitely avoid saying things like that, because we can't concede that that's the case. I mean, that we can't, and we don't. And the Sharia doesn't either, right? I mean, if you're a biological male, you're a male in the Sharia. And if you're a biological female, you're a female. You can't change gender and have the laws and the rulings of the other sex applied to you. And of course, the solution, well, just get rid of all the, gender specific legislation. Okay, throw the entire like Sharia out the window, right? So it's, one has to be, my suggestion would be on a case-by-case basis, try to deal with other people sensitively, especially on a personal level, like by using if they say, this is my name and this is my pronoun, especially if they kind of like already look very much like the sex that they're transitioning to. Okay, you're not responsible for that. The person looks like a female, goes by female name, asks to be called she. Khalas, I mean, that's not really your issue, right? Or vice versa. But again, when it comes to more generic statements that entail a commitment to sort of metaphysical premises, like gender really is just in your head and nothing else, and therefore men can get pregnant and so on and so forth, and women can impregnate others. I mean, this is a whole different level, and it's not reasonable that people should be expected to conform with this, in my opinion. At the same time, the presuppositions of the opposite paradigm, if you take them seriously, well then, for them, they'll say, well, it's a slippery slope. I mean, if you're allowed to, speak insensitively here, then why not there? And if you're going to respect a person's pronoun, then also don't exclude them by speaking about only women getting pregnant, because there are men who can, people who identify as men or are men, right? If you accept that identifying as a man actually makes you a man, who can get pregnant too. So you're being exclusionary by speaking about pregnant women. But what does it mean to say that human language now has to be excised of a phrase as obvious and universal as pregnant women? I mean, in this discussion, this culture is not allowing us to have, because you're not allowed to engage sort of metaphysical and deep ethical questions like that. Everything has been exchanged for a kind of superficial, discourse of rights and minorities and discrimination and all of that, which is on steroids, way beyond, it's going to self-destruct. I don't know when, but it's anything based on falsehood to that degree cannot maintain itself for very long. That's the way I see it. Wallahu a'lam.
Okay. Let's go to another question. This is more about sexuality. How to positively handle our children's sexual curiosity and potential teenage lust, especially with peer pressure / hypersexualized entertainment, media, and internet's easy access to pornographic content.
Yeah, I mean, I asked the same question. I have teenagers. It's very difficult. I think that one, to be brief, one has to instill a moral Islamic aqidah, proper aqidah, and morals and ethics and adab and so forth from an early age as strongly as one can, hopefully so that the child has a strong basis, a strong moral basis, where they will understand the dangers of these things and will be amenable to environments and so forth that will help them steer clear of that type of danger. Number two, it's important to have a good home environment, an environment based on deen, meaning deen also not just formalistically, but in terms of the way family members treat each other with kindness, compassion, respect, so on and so forth, where there's deep love of Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right, in an attempt at connection and so forth, so that the children feel that they have a home in their home and they're not alienated from it. The more alienated children feel, the more open they are to others, okay? I think it's also important to have strong sub-communities of like-minded Muslim families, right? Who and they're there, of course, Muslim families are there, but they really need to come together to try to say, okay, we will, especially if they have kids, who are similar in age, to really make those other kids their play dates and so forth. And if at all possible, I mean, if one can sort of control the circle of friends enough, then you can even make collective policies on things like technology. Like none of our kids have a cell phone until they're X years old. And because they're all just friends with each other, mostly, none of them feels particularly deprived, because all of their other immediate friends don't really have it either, so they're not like really left out. That's a tougher call. When it comes to the instruments themselves, I mean, you've got to put protections on there. Pornography is extremely dangerous. It's extremely devious. It's extremely destructive, morally, spiritually, and has so many, and it's highly addictive, especially for boys. And I think it's just, it's really cruel to leave a child, anyone, but especially someone whose capacities for moral decision-making and stuff are, as we know scientifically, are still developing through the teenage years, right? It's really cruel to leave them, especially a young boy, alone with a device where all he has to do is type in SEX go, and just, there's just no limit to what's there, right? And this is something that's completely unnatural. It's totally artificial, never existed before in human society. The camera was created in 1839. Before that, you had no photographs. People could draw pictures of things, and we have like, erotic art from before that period. But this was very rare and not very realistic and this and that. But to actually be able to photograph another human being in particular sexual acts, this is something probably most human beings never saw throughout their entire lives, throughout all of history, because you would never have seen that unless someone were doing it in front of your eyes, which no one would really do. Okay, the fact that you have people producing porn in front of a camera and then that's mass distributed, this is completely unprecedented and artificial. And our brains are, whether you take it from a religious perspective or an evolutionary, materialistic, whatever perspective, our brains were not made to be able to handle that type of sexual stimulus that strong, that easily available, and it wreaks havoc on our brains. It wreaks havoc on our emotional lives. It wreaks havoc on our moral standing, right? But even physiologically, and especially for men, right? Pornography addiction is a real thing, and it's very destructive. And it destroys families, it destroys marriages, it destroys men's sexuality. They can no longer get aroused except through extreme input because they're so used to seeing such graphic material all the time. There are men who, when they're with women, they can't perform unless they have porn going on behind the bed, looking at it. This is a disaster, right? So people, whatever, don't be a prude. No, this is very serious. And the people who thought it was a brilliant idea in the 60s to just open the gates and allow all of this stuff, may they pay the price for what they've done, because they've really unleashed a very destructive and evil force upon the world. And this is what happens when men think they're God, right? We don't need God. We throw God out the window. We don't care what religion says. We don't care no constraints. We do whatever, we make the laws. We want pornography, child pornography, no problem, right? And that's exactly what happened when in 2015, people said, okay, let's just change marriage. Who cares what it's meant throughout all of history and every other legal system and religious system? Let's just make it two men, why not? People playing God, right? And when you play with fire like that, you're going to get burned. And so we have to be very careful of things like that. We also have to make sure our children understand these things. So that would be my advice.
Okay, Jazakallah khair for that. And I think it's gotten to the point, it's 6:53. So we're going to bring this session now to an end. Inshallah, maybe we can possibly do a follow-up. We will let you guys know if you want to discuss this more, we can possibly do a follow-up session in the future. Inshallah, if Dr. Sharif would like to,
Sure.
Share his knowledge again with us. So yes, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And inshallah, take care, and please give us your feedback. Thank you so much so far for everyone who has given us their feedback. And we really appreciate it. We really appreciate you guys attending. Everyone who came together and made this possible, Jazakallah khair for your efforts. May Allah reward you for that. And
trivia,
yes.
sister, to come through.
Oh yes, we have trivia. We have trivia that we were going to do. So
I'm gonna have to sign out because I have to run to another.
Yes, of course.
Sure.
So, Jazakumullah khair again. Thank you for hosting me. It was a pleasure to be with all of you. Whatever I said of good is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May you put benefit in it. Anything that I said that was wrong or incorrect or offensive, it is from myself and from the shaitan. I ask Allah first and foremost, and then I ask you to forgive me for that. And I pray that Allah keep us all firm on His deen, that He protect our children, that He protect our families, Ameen, inshallah, they
Ameen.
allow us to be beacons of light, beacons of guidance, and beacons of sanity in a world that has lost its bearings. Jazakumullahu khairan, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
For everybody else, we'll do this because we want to end now, of course, also time, those who have to still pray. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll do a different type of trivia. We have the trivia already on a Google form, and I'm about to post a link of that on the chat. Just go there, and if you answer them correctly, and whoever submitted the top 4, we will, inshallah ta'ala, send you an Amazon gift card for that one. But thank you again for everybody else, and back to you, Sister.
Yeah, so everybody go to the link, and inshallah, we look forward to getting your responses. If y'all have any other feedback that you would like to give us, please feel free to give that to us. And inshallah, we will have this session recorded and available for you to view. And that's really all we have for now. So everybody, hope inshallah everybody stays well. Take care, and jazakallah khair for attending. And we really appreciate you being here.
Where are you going to post the video, the recording?
The video is on YouTube. There's a link that I just posted for it.
Okay, jazakumullah khair.
Why? All right, inshallah. Sure. Please end with the
Okay. Jazakallah khair, everybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And please take care. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless everyone who attended, and give us all knowledge, and bless us with the right direction in our lives, inshallah, and especially with this issue, and help us navigate the challenges of this life, and reward us for our efforts. Ameen. Jazakallah khair.